beginning of the universe. My first argument demonstrates this and more. The cosmological argument may be stated in this way. 1. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. 2. The universe began to exist. Therefore, 3. The universe must have a cause for its existence. Now, this is referred to by philosophers as a logically valid syllogism. What that means is that if premise 1 and premise 2 are both true, then it follows necessarily that the conclusion is also true. So if everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then it follows necessarily and inescapably that the universe must have had a cause. Physicists today have come to recognize that prior to the existence of the universe, not only did matter not exist, but even space and time did not exist. Even though it may sound strange at first, when the universe did not exist, there was literally nothing. As British physicist P.C.W. Davies says, quote, "The coming into being of the universe, as described in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing a level of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. This means that whatever caused the universe to come into existence must not fall into any of the physical categories I mentioned before. It must be a cause outside of time, not made of matter, and not confined by space. To put it even more simply, it is either a natural cause or what we might refer to as a supernatural cause. And since we're talking about the very coming into being of all of nature itself, including space and time, the only option that we are left with is a supernatural cause. That means that it must be a spaceless, non-material, and timeless or eternal cause. And it must have had a mind, since it had to decide to cause the universe to exist from literally nothing. Amazingly, this is what even the most basic definition would be of God. What is the alternative? The alternative to this would be to maintain that the universe came by nothing, from nothing, and for nothing. As Anthony Kinney says, quote, "A proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing." However, I can't imagine that we would accept something like this. In the words of Bernhoff Schneider, it would be, quote, "in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely, that out of nothing, nothing comes," end quote. In light of this argument, or this alternative, one is either forced to believe that, on the one hand, the universe emerged uncaused out of nothing at all, or that God exists as the necessary uncaused cause of the entire universe. When faced with that dilemma, the answer seems clear to me, and I think it does to many of you. 2, the second line of reasoning involves the incredible amount of complexity in the physical universe. The incredible degree of fine-tuning that we encounter when we consider the initial conditions of the universe would be prohibitively unlikely in the absence of God. Stephen Hawking, who is now made even more popular by his new book, The Grand Design, has estimated that if the rate of the universe's expansion 1 second after the universe began had been smaller by even 1 part in, get this, 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed into a fireball. P.C.W. Davies has calculated that in order to be suitable for later star formation, without which planets couldn't exist, the initial conditions of the universe must be fine-tuned to a precision of 1 followed by 1,000 billion zeros at least. He also shows that a change in the force of gravity, or of the weak force by only 1 part in 10 to the 100th power would have prevented a life-permitting universe. What could account for such a degree of fine-tuning? Dr. William Lane Craig argues that there are 3 alternatives: natural law, chance, or intelligent design. Well, what about this first alternative of natural law? The first alternative demands that the initial conditions were a necessary state. That is to say, that it could not have been otherwise. Davies says there is nothing in the laws of physics that demonstrate the necessity of the initial conditions. The universe, he says, did not have to be the way that it is. It could have been otherwise. So natural law will not do as an explanation. But what about the second alternative, chance? The problem with this is that when one considers the astronomical possibility of varying values in the initial conditions, and considering the number of possible value sets that would have resulted in a life-permitting universe, it is clear that the possibility of such fine-tuning as exists in the initial conditions of the actual universe, that is to say, this universe, is infinitesimally small. It is simply nowhere near conceivable that this could have happened by mere chance. So Fred Hoyle says, quote, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics." Robert Jastrow, the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, says this is the most powerful evidence for the existence of God ever to come out of science. So if natural law and chance will not account for the fine-tuning of the initial conditions, then the only live option to which the evidence leads would have to be intelligent design. And this brings me to 3. The third argument I'd like to present is the argument from the objectivity of moral values. The moral argument could be stated like this. 1. If objective moral values exist, then God also exists. 2. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, 3. God exists. When I say objective moral values, I'm referring to moral values that are true and binding whether anybody believes in them or not. As Norman Geisler has put it, to claim that the Holocaust was objectively wrong, that is to say, really wrong, is to say that it would have been wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and exterminated or brainwashed everyone who disagreed with them. It would still have been wrong to have done the Holocaust even if everybody believed that it was okay. We're saying that moral objectivity means that it is wrong to murder or to rape, and that is a wrong action in the same sense that 2 + 2 = 7 would be a wrong statement. I hope that you understand that. And this is something that many atheists will accept. Michael Roos, noted agnostic philosopher of science, says, quote, "The position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate," he says, "that when someone says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." Now, let me make clear what I'm not saying. I am not saying that unless you believe in God or agree that morality is objective in this sense, that you cannot act morally or do things that are right. Atheists and theists alike can act morally and immorally. What I am saying is that without God, it is not true to say that murder or rape or child abuse is objectively wrong in the same sense that 2 + 2 = 7 is objectively wrong. Ultimately, if God does not exist, then to say that certain things are right and wrong and other things are wrong becomes a matter of cultural opinion or consensus. But such morals as those would be subjective in that they could be amended or changed as societal ideas changed. Friedrich Nietzsche, the atheist scholar who famously said, "God is dead," understood that God's death meant the end of objective morality in humanity. But, as William Lane Craig would say, objective moral values do exist. And deep down, I think we all know that. If you think that it's not objectively wrong to torture children for fun, for example, then you don't need an argument for me to persuade you. You need therapy. And since objective moral values exist, then God must exist as a grounding for those objective moral values. I agree with what Michael Roos and what many others have said. If there is no God, then ultimately right and wrong is just a matter of taste or opinion. For this reason, I maintain that the evidence presented by these three arguments is so strong that it warrants belief in the existence of God. And if there's going to be shown something wrong with these arguments, I look forward to hearing what they are. Thank you very much.
Good evening, buenas tardes. Dios los bendiga. ¿Me escuchan bien? Okay. Very impressive, Braxton. Very, very impressive presentation of the theistic arguments by Dr. Braxton. Let me say as a preface to my comments that the issue between us is not whether we believe in God. It's whether we believe in God on the basis of evidence that is sufficient rationally to convince us with a high degree of probability that there is a God. My stance is that my relationship to God is based on experience and faith. There I side with Jonathan Edwards, the great Puritan theologian. It's about the heart. With the great German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher. Perhaps because of Karl Barth, who has also influenced my thought, I have an aversion to natural theology, but I recognize that that's just a prejudice that I must be willing to yield on the basis of argument. I don't want to retreat into an irrational fightyism, and I want to be able to listen and be open to new thoughts, including evidence, even though at this particular juncture in history, I may not believe that the evidence warrants belief in God as Dr. Braxton has presented it. But I'm willing to be persuaded, so I'm not going to close my mind. Okay, the cosmological argument is a causal argument working from effects back to cause. And there's no question, I would agree with Dr. Braxton that God is a sufficient condition or ground for the existence of the universe. If there were a God, then I would grant that God would be enough to bring the classical God of theism. God would be enough of a cause to bring the universe about. I mean, after all, He's all-powerful, He's infinite, He's eternal. Certainly, the universe being finite, He could bring it about. Therefore, I would grant that He's a sufficient condition. The problem that I have with the cosmological argument has to do with the more difficult issue as to whether God is a necessary condition. My claim is that the logical structure of Dr. Braxton's arguments rely precisely on what I think is extremely difficult to establish, that you can argue from effect back to the cause. And I think that is the underlying problem with your presentation, Dr. Braxton. For instance, if I shower today and I walk in here wet, everybody would grant that my taking a shower, right, and not drying myself up with a towel is a sufficient condition for me being wet, correct? But if I am wet, I could not argue and say I am wet only because I took a shower. Maybe I got wet because of rain, or somebody threw water on me, or something like that. And I think the structure of these theistic arguments is we have an effect, we have a data, we have morality, presumably we do, or we have the universe, or we have some sort of complexity in the universe. Therefore, from this effect, the argument is, well, the only thing that could account for that is God. I think there is enough. My argument is not that God could not do it. My argument is that I don't think the evidence warrants, not even with a high degree of probability, that God is the cause of the universe. Again, I'm separating the question of evidence from the question of faith. My relationship to God and to Christ is based on my having accepted Christ as my Savior on January 22nd, 1970. And that experience has continued to sustain me through all the doubts of skepticism, all the storms that I have gone through. But I cannot say that that experience of God is evidence, incontrovertible evidence, that I can from that experience go back, walk back to God. I have to rely on faith, and I have to live by faith. And there I stand with Edwards and with Schleiermacher. All right, so again, God exists, therefore the universe exists. God exists has to be, it's not the argument, right? If God exists, I grant you, the universe, God is enough to bring the universe into existence. But the argument really is the universe exists, therefore the only cause of the universe, right, is God exists. The only way to explain the existence of the universe is God exists. And I repeat, it is difficult to argue from effect back to cause. Now, the Big Bang does seem to lend support to a finite universe, and I think every scientist today worth anything is willing to grant that the universe is indeed finite, that it had a beginning. But again, the beginning need not be a theistic God. The Big Bang theory, as we have it in science, not in religion, not in creationism, is completely silent as to what may have caused the Big Bang. It's not either God or nothing. We just don't know. So the real attitude, the real responsible attitude is we do not have enough evidence to work our way back to God. We must remain silent. And any triumphalist claims that the evidence dictates that it must be God is just simply illusory. Now, Dr. Braxton quoted Stephen Hawking's The Grand Design. And I think that when Stephen Hawking, in his latest book, says that the universe, the question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Which is really an expression of what is called the principle of sufficient reason. There must be a sufficient reason why something exists. Hawkins says, well, we've answered the question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, because the universe comes from nothing. Now, I've oversimplified what Hawkins is saying. I grant you that. But the fact of the matter is, he does accept the universe, the explanation of the universe is that it has no explanation. It came from nothing. Now, intuitively, most of us have been weaned on the principle of sufficient reason. Most of us intuitively accept that that reason is rational. Let me add that the principle of sufficient reason, as defended by Leibniz, the grateful German philosopher of the 17th century, he himself could not prove that that principle was logical. So if it is not logical, it's an empirical issue. Intuition counts for nothing. Intuition is not evidence and it's not logic. We have been wrong about many of our logical intuitions. For many centuries, we've believed that the axiom of parallels of Euclid was logically and absolutely certain. And yet, general relativity has proved that that axiom is empirical. It has been disproved. Even today, quantum mechanics shows that the law of the excluded middle, P or not P, which was taken as a law of logic ever since Aristotle began to codify logic, that itself is also an empirical issue. Therefore, I think it is very difficult to defend any principle on a priori grounds, such as the principle of sufficient reason, and just simply assume it willy-nilly as if we did not have to defend it. The principle is questionable, and we don't have to assume it, despite the fact that I grant it is culturally counterintuitive, but not necessarily false. Therefore, the universe may not have needed a reason in the way the principle demands, and it may not have needed God or anything for that matter. It simply may have come out of nothing. Now, I will not go as far as Hawkins is saying that, indeed, that comes out of nothing. I'm going to see more evidence on the part of Stephen Hawking. So far, his hypothesis is as controversial as his theistic one. I reject, on the basis of the evidence, both the theistic hypothesis and that we came from nothing. I stand. The evidence is simply not enough to certify either view. The argument from design is getting a lot of ink today. And I agree that it is impressive. Even the philosopher Immanuel Kant, he's a great work, The Critique of Pure Reason, written in 1781, when he evaluated and severely criticized all these arguments, granted that the argument from the sign was the one that had the highest probability of being true, of proving that God existed. And Dr. Braxton has brought up concepts like intelligent design, or he has brought up concepts like the anthropic principle, or the fine-tuned universe. And I have gone to the University of Miami at FIU. I have met with and heard different defenders of intelligent design who have presented quite interesting pieces of evidence from molecular biology. But they have always, all of them concluded uniformly that right now all we have is piecemeal details that are very suggestive, but we don't have anything comprehensive enough to constitute a theory, let's say on the level of Darwin's theory of evolution, as far as we can tell from the evidence, until more evidence is produced for intelligent design at the micro level. We simply have to remain agnostic and yield to the fact that the evidence is simply not enough. Now, what about the big picture, the universe, the intelligent, the anthropic principle, the fine-tuned universe? Dr. Braxton quoted that even Stephen Hawking, right, supports the principle that if things had been different 1 degree, I believe that's the word used, might not have been, the universe would not have evolved the way it did evolve. But look, the fact of the matter is, Dr. Braxton also admitted, another scientist says, the universe would have been different. Furthermore, the technical results in biology simply, this elaborate complexity that biology and science and elegance and fit and so on, that all suggest that there's some intelligent design. Again, I repeat, it's simply not enough. The idea, however, the idea of a blind mechanism, which is what natural selection, right, Darwin's theory of natural selection really is, could produce a highly complex organism in which even external conditions, such as the distance from our sun, seem to work together in a harmonious fit for the benefit of human species. All of that, right, the Darwin's theory, the blind mechanism of Richard Dawkins, his interpretation of evolution, sounds rightly counterintuitive, but I submit to you the counterintuitiveness is just simply not enough to support the intelligent design's view. There are two competing views, but only the Darwinian view, only the view in which there is no design, in which the universe is a blind mechanism, has a comprehensive theory. What do the intelligent design people have? Piecemeal critiques. They poke holes, but they offer no comprehensive theory. Until I see a comprehensive theory that is experimentally supported by the evidence, then I cannot let go. I cannot relinquish Darwin, and I cannot relinquish that from the point of view of the evidence, the universe is indeed the blind mechanism that Dawkins and before him, David Hume, says it is. Lastly, on this point, the fine-tuned universe can be interpreted without the God hypothesis. We have survived because we have adapted to conditions, not because we've been chosen or because the universe has been fine-tuned. Look, if the universe had been slightly closer to the sun, there would be no human life as we know it. Life would be totally different, right? But just because we are where we are, it means human life evolved. It means we have adapted to these conditions, right? Right now we're thinking of other different planets around the universe that perhaps may have conditions for the evolution of life. Not because of design, but because they fulfill the right conditions. Not by design, but I can say it, by chance, as far as the evidence seems. Look, when any one of us wins the lottery, and I have never won the lottery, all of us feel there must have been a plan. There must have been a design that made me win the lottery, right? In other words, we are the survivors. Of course we feel chosen. Of course we feel the universe has been fine-tuned for our pleasure, because our view of the universe is highly anthropocentric. Only survivors get to write history. Only survivors can talk about a God who is benevolent and who has created everything for our good. That's just, from an evidential point of view, a fiction. The evidence is not enough. As I said, when you win the lottery, it's not by design, it's what's chance, but it does feel to you that it was by some grand design. Hume's evidential argument, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Hume's evidential argument, it still stands. The universe appears to be, from the point of view of evidence, a poor architect, not that rational intelligent creator. Look at the diseases. Look at the earthquakes, the asteroid that could strike at any moment and wipe us from the face of the earth. Right? They could destroy it. 60 million years ago, the dinosaurs were destroyed. Right? What design did the universe show for them? What benevolence did the universe show for them? According to science, 95 to 98% of all species have become extinct. Again, we are the survivors. For us, there is design. But what about for the rest of life? There's no design for them. What about the tsunami 5 years ago that killed 250,000 people in Indonesia? What about the earthquake in Haiti that killed 150,000 and the misery in that country is still going? Where is the design? We who live in the most privileged part of the world, who enjoy all these benefits, of course for us there is design because we feel chosen. But look at it more objectively from the point of the evidence. There is no such thing. It is quite fictitious. Lastly, the moral argument that there is an objective morality. The major flaw with that response is that, unfortunately, it begs the question. You cannot start an argument by assuming there is an objective morality. As far as the evidence goes, there is no objective morality. And the morality that we do have, we can account on purely naturalistic terms. We don't need the God hypothesis to explain why killing is bad. Killing is bad because it causes suffering. Adultery is bad because it causes suffering and pain, right? And nobody wants anybody else to cheat on you. That's why. Look at the Old Testament. Look at the code of ethics of the New Testament. You don't need a God to derive that. We can derive it from our own minds and experience. We have learned quite a bit in our evolution, and we can figure those things out. Furthermore, there is a lot of disagreement, and there is no evidence at all, except in the imagination of Dr. Braxton and like-minded thinkers, that there is such a thing as an objective morality. Of course, I agree. If I assume an objective morality, then the God hypothesis makes a lot of sense. Since I don't assume it, and I think the evidence shows that I don't have to, therefore, I reject it. Thank you very much.
All right, well, let me respond to some of the things that Professor Alvarez has so passionately said tonight during his opening remarks. First, when he comes to discuss the cosmological argument for the existence of God, he agrees that God is perhaps a sufficient explanation for the universe. However, he says, but we cannot argue that he is a necessary cause for the existence of the universe. At first, he seemed to give no response to the argument itself, but then he did come around to say a couple of things, and I want to comment on those right here from the start. He said first, well, we don't know what could have been actually the cause for the Big Bang. It could have been the case that it wasn't God, but that it was something else. Well, first of all, let me make clear that this, I think, is a misunderstanding of the argument. I'm not saying that the cause of the Big Bang has to be God. I'm saying that the cause of the universe itself must be God. Here's what that means. Even if there is, as some physicists have hypothesized, even if there were a chain of Big Bangs, even if it were the case that there was a Big Bang and then it collapsed in on itself, and then another Big Bang and it collapsed in on itself, if that went on over and over again, there was an initial point in time where the beginning of the universe must have occurred. And the cause of that beginning would have to be God. Now, then he goes to address the matter of Stephen Hawking's and his new book, The Grand Design. And he says, I'm not really all that persuaded ultimately by Hawking either. I'm not persuaded by Braxton. I'm not persuaded by Hawking. He says Hawking claims also that the universe began out of literally nothing. However, even though this is what Stephen Hawking claims that he holds in his book, when you actually read The Grand Design, as I have, you come to find that the moment of the origin of the universe actually occurred in space and in time. Here is the problem with that. Space, even if time did not exist and only space exists, that is still something. And if something existed, then that's not the universe coming from literally nothing. Well, then he says, you can't argue back from the effect to the cause. And then he gave an example of how he may come in here wet and we assume that he took a shower. Well, here's my response to that. I would ask Professor Alvarez to give me any other alternative that would explain the existence of the universe. Now, he seemed to touch on that point in anticipation that I might make it. He said, well, we're simply not at the place in modern physics where we can say anything with any degree of certainty about the initial cause of the universe. However, I think that this is just a misunderstanding. We can know some things about what the cause must have been. Because it was the cause of the universe, remember, not just the other thing before the Big Bang, the actual cause of the whole universe coming into existence out of literally no time, no space, no matter at all, then it must have been not a natural cause, but what we could refer to as a supernatural cause. That means it could not be anything that's in the universe. As I already said in my opening remarks, it can't be in time. It can't occupy space. It cannot be comprised of matter. And so we already know that much. Now, someone might say, as may have been implied already, well, what about something else that could have caused it that falls into those categories? Say, for example, something else that is not in time, not material, and not in space. There are things like that. Some mathematicians think that perhaps the principle 2 + 2 = 4 would still exist as a concept even outside of our universe. But here's the problem. Abstract concepts such as that are not things that have what we call causal powers. The only things that are like that do have causal powers, are minds. And so I say to you that a mind that is outside of time, outside of space, not made of matter, is the only alternative as a cause for the universe. And I don't say this as a God of the gaps sort of fallacy, like the ancient religions may have said, we don't know what lightning is, so we attribute it to God. No, rather I'm saying, based on what we do know, deductively we can come to understand certain things about what this cause would have been. Now let me move forward. He then talks about the design argument. Let me say right from the start, he said quite a bit about evolution. But I want you to notice, in my opening remarks, I said nothing about biological evolution. I focused all of my guns on the early moments of the universe. And for that reason, I argued those things which are somewhat outside of biological evolution here on Earth. He mentioned that he's gone to other places and gone to some prestigious universities. And there he's spoken to people who find that the evidence is not conclusive. Well, that's interesting. I'd love to have them here to discuss it with them. But a second point needs to be made about such people. The important thing to notice is, when he mentioned them and microbiology, that is not what I was mentioning. I didn't say anything about evolution. Even if evolution turns out to be the case, this would not explain the design that we find at the initial moments of the universe, at the origin, the first few seconds after the universe began to exist. And for that reason, I don't think that biological evolution really has much to say to our topic tonight. Let's see, what else did he mention? He mentioned that I quoted one physicist as saying things could have been different, and the universe didn't have to happen the way it did. Yes, I did say that. However, my point was not, and the point of that physicist is not to say that it could have been different and been life-permitting. That is possible, but I can't tell you how small the probability is. It is vanishingly small, the chance that that could have happened. That is why, when he mentioned a moment ago, well, I don't think that there is a extremely high probability that on the evidence that God caused the universe, I am showing exactly that when I show that chance will not account for this. He then mentions, well, okay, but there are many things that happen every day that are the chances are infinitesimally small, like winning the lottery. And I hope if you did win the lottery that you are tithing to your church, I might say. But I would say that even in such a case, that is extremely unique. However, what intelligent design advocates argue is not just that something that incredibly unlikely happens warrants belief in God or warrants belief in intelligent design, but rather that incredibly high levels of improbability and independent specified complexity. Let me give you an example. What if we were all playing bridge? And if we were, you would win, because I don't know much about bridge. But what if we were all playing bridge, and every single time that I played a hand, I played a perfect bridge hand? After a while, you would begin to get incredibly skeptical about my honesty. And you would want to know how I was manipulating the game and cheating you out of your bridge game. In the same way, we're not just saying that it's incredible improbability. Every time someone deals a deck of cards to you, say in a poker game, any arrangement is incredibly improbable. But it's the specified complexity of having the perfect hand to win the game that tips you off that it happens several times in a relatively small period of time. Something else is going on here, right? So he mentions that. I don't want to miss anything. I don't want to miss saying anything else. Okay, he talks about suffering in the world. He says, well, okay, or design, poor design. He says there's all these examples of poorly designed things, or things that don't function very well, or things that we can imagine on the evidence could have been better designed. Well, let me just say that poor design, from our perspective, does not mean an absence of design. I've become aware that in Cuba, and this may be a negative term, I don't know, there's a certain kind of car. And it's, can I use that term? A footingo, right? Is that right? Okay. I understand that term is used for an old car or a poorly designed car. However, a footingo may be more poorly designed than a brand new 2010 BMW. But it's still designed and gives incredible evidence of that. And that's important that you understand that. That's so vital that you understand such a thing. We can pinpoint design. That's what archaeologists do. Intelligent design is not just confined to evolution or to the universe. It's also what archaeologists are doing. And so let me move on. What about the incredible amount of suffering that goes on in the world? Well, the logical argument from evil that is somehow incompatible with the existence of God has been put to bed by philosophers today. There is no contradiction so long as we can imagine anything that would explain the two. That's called a philosophical defeater, such as the free will theodicy, the idea that God wanted to create beings of free will. What about objective moral values? He says, I simply just don't accept that morality is objective. Fine, you can say that, and I don't have time to defend that further right now, maybe in my next speech, but I'll say this. If you adopt that, even though this may seem unpopular, what you are saying is that there's nothing really wrong with the rape and murder of a child.
Is it 5 minutes? I don't know. Oh, yes. Yes. Okay. On the cosmological argument, I'm surprised you use the word deductively, while all your arguments seem to be inductive. As far as I know, the only deductive argument is the ontological argument, and nobody has invoked it here tonight. And these arguments are not strictly deductive by definition. They're all inductive. They're all based on probability. So I was a little confused about that. I don't understand what you mean by saying I know that that this is the only alternative. That's precisely what's at issue here. It is not the only alternative. We have all this universe, all this complexity. Yes, I grant you that God would be a sufficient condition, given the definition of the classical God, to bring it about. But to say that any other explanation other than God is the other than the universe, it's just simply so way beyond the evidence that I really I don't understand why you made it. And again, the comment about deductively, that somehow deductively we can establish that it is God, left me completely befuddled. There's no... I still stand by what I said. I don't think you have refuted what I've said. You just simply made claims that simply had to be God. It couldn't have been anything else, but I see no proof. The evidence simply is ambiguous. Again, this doesn't mean that there is no God. I'm not saying that there is no God. I'm simply saying on the basis of evidence, which is what's at issue here. It's just simply not enough to establish, to work our way back from the effect to the cause. On the intelligent design issue, again, now you did use there the high level of probability, and you brought up the argument from evil, which in a way was underlying some of the comments that I was making to show that there is indeed a great deal of suffering in the universe. And then you brought up supposedly the two refutations of the problem of evil. One is the free will defense of Alvin Plantinga. But I think, with all due respect to Alvin Plantinga's argument, the free will defense handles moral evil quite well. Notice I did not blame God for Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. I did not blame God for massacres that human beings have and continue to perpetrate on human beings. Those are things for which we're responsible, and we simply cannot blame God. All my examples were cases of natural evil, and I don't think that free will defense works very well with natural evil. Now, the other argument is the other argument is a little more subtle, and I grant you that the atheist Nelson Pike, in a very famous paper, he's an atheist, in a very famous paper that I've studied carefully called Human Evil, actually does refute the logical argument from evil that Hume gives us in part 11 of the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. I grant you that. But look at the argument. The real issue turns on this. Could God have had a sufficiently moral reason for allowing the suffering that exists in the universe? Well, if you're a parent and your child is sick and you put him into the bathtub with ice because he or she has a high fever, that child is suffering, right? You have put him under the ice so that you can bring the fever down and you can save his life and save his brain from brain damage. So Pike convincingly argued that God could have had a sufficiently moral reason for allowing the amount of evil that there is. And it would be presumptuous of Hume and of myself to say that there is so much evil that there is no way for there to be a God. Which is what really Hume wanted to get out of that argument, right? Because the evil is so immense that there is no way for a God who is omnipotent and wholly good to have allowed it. My argument is not even Hume's, any more than it was Hawking's argument. I think Hawkins goes way beyond the evidence. His posture is unscientific by his own standards. I judge Hume the way Nelson Pike judges him. He goes way beyond the evidence. However, having said that, is there enough evidence from the suffering that we have that we can guarantee that there is a God? No. The evidence that we have keeps mounting. That seems to be, as Richard Dawkins says, from the point of view of evidence, a blind process with no meaning and purpose. And the meaning and purpose that we see is as much derived from our imputation, our imposing meaning on this vast, meaningless cosmic process that is totally indifferent to us. The evidence seems to be in that direction, if there is evidence at all. But I grant you, right, that the evidence is not enough to guarantee, to prove deductively or otherwise that there is no God, but the evidence is serious enough to make me doubt that any of these arguments support the existence of God. I think the suffering of human beings, the extinctions of species that I have cited, the fact that right now we're under Damocles' sword, ready at any moment to be extinguished like the dinosaurs were extinguished by an asteroid. I think those ideas, those possibilities may have to force us to be a little bit more modest and circumspect in how far we're willing to push theistic arguments. Therefore, I'm going to take it as the fact that you misspoke when you use deductive. I would say there is not even a high probability. Now, let me address the issue of probability. There's no question that Richard Swinburne, in his great trilogy, The Existence of God, The Coherence of Theism, he has put forward the most important defense of classical theism there is, and he does it on the basis of probability. But even Swinburne admits that his argument from probability is not enough to prove the God of theism by itself. That is why he offers many arguments that cumulative are supposed to produce that effect. But even Swinburne has a problem. To argue from probability, you have to establish an antecedent probability. And right now, even probability theorists admit that it is very difficult to rule out, to say that naturalism has less intrinsic or prior probability than theism. From the point of view of evidence, both are equally good or equally bad. Probability theory simply cannot be invoked to support the existence of God, unless you already assign a prior probability to theism vis-a-vis naturalism. The moral argument, comments on the moral argument. If I can find it. I'm sorry. I apologize. You continue to reiterate precisely what you have not proven, that there is an objective morality. I grant you, it would be nice, perhaps God could be the ground of an objective morality. Even there, I'm not sure. I'm very sensitive to Plato's critique in the Euthyphro. Do the gods love the good because it is good, or is the good good because the gods love it? Kant, in the famous work of 1793, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, says there are many things in the Bible, there are many things attributed to the God of classical theism, where he goes and he orders genocide. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16, he orders the extermination, and there's no other way to use here, you cannot gild the lily, the extermination of the Canaanites, and says, do not leave alive anything that breathes. If we're going to base morality on God, and say not on natural law or not on reason, I think we have a problem. Yes, morality on reason has a problem. Morality on natural law basis has a problem. But I think morality on the basis of God has a problem too. Because as you admitted, God's ways, you implied it, you didn't use the words, God's ways are not our ways. Right? The universe shows poor design, but poor design is no design at all. Right? You cannot say that there is nothing. So, because God can ordain extermination of Canaanites, well, to us it doesn't look too cool, but look, from God's point of view, it has to be good. I think that morality based on God is fraught with great difficulties, as Plato and Kant pointed out, and none of what you said, independently of what I just said about Plato and Kant's problems with qualms about the argument from God, none of your statements argue for an objective morality. You continue to beg the question and assume it without warrant.
Okay. So now both of the opponents have 5 minutes.
All right, well, that was a very passionate speech by Professor Alvarez. However, let me point out a couple of things that I have not argued tonight that Professor Alvarez seems to think that I have argued. I have not argued for the inerrancy of Christian Scripture. I have not mentioned anything about the atrocities of the Old Testament. And however, Professor Alvarez has just given an example of why we should not accept God's kind of morality, or at least on the basis of evidence, because of what we see in the Bible, or at least that's one good reason. But I think this just falls on deaf ears. I've not brought up the Bible tonight. Let me go to the problem of evil, and let me address the issue of objective morality first, and we'll work in reverse order. What exactly is Professor Alvarez saying about morality? Is he saying that on the evidence, morality has simply arisen because of societal decisions about what seems to work best, that is pragmatism? Is that what we're saying? Because if that's the case, then, and if reproduction is the ultimate goal then of evolution, and this is sort of an evolutionary morality, then please tell me why it is that rape is not something that we consider to be morally allowable. Why is that? After all, we see it in the animal kingdom, don't we? After all, animals rape, and guess what? That is good for reproduction. If occasionally one of the males in this room decided that he would rape another female, it would create more offspring perhaps. So in the same sense that the animals do that, if it's all about reproduction, if it's all about evolution, societal or otherwise, then why is this not the case? However, we don't find that to be the case. And furthermore, we find that some people are willing to do things that are incredibly harmful to themselves and in fact succeed in their own death for the support and help of other people. I don't see how we can justify this if morality is not objective. Experience, not intuitive experience, but what we see in the world and how we function in it tells me that morality is objective and it must be grounded in the very nature of God. So there is that. Another thing that I would mention is he mentions the problem of evil, and I have to say I was surprised that you argued that so ardently considering your theism. However, I know you're working just from the evidence, and so we'll keep it confined to that. He says, okay, the logical argument from evil has indeed been put to bed. Or maybe I'm overstating that, but it's not the issue at this point. And in fact, it is kind of hard to discern always which role Hume adopts in his book when he's using these different mouthpieces. However, that's all right. I think the point can still be made. Let's assume he is adopting that position of arguing the problem of evil. And let's go with an evidential argument of evil instead of Hume's. How can we say that that God, there's a high probability that God is still just in spite of what seem to be gratuitous evils taking place in the world? This is what William Rowe argues, the atheist. He argues this. And he uses two examples, and I don't have time to go in those, but one involves the brutality on a young girl and an animal that dies, and there's nothing that comes from that. However, John Wykstra has provided an answer to this that I think is glaringly obvious once you think about it. The only way that William Rowe's argument sticks and reduces the probability of the existence of God is if it is the case that if such purposes or goods that might result from some evils, if those should be evident to us. As I was saying in a question and answer time last night, we can't conclude that there is no gold on the planet Pluto. Why? Because if there was gold on the planet Pluto, we would have no way of being able to obviously see that from Earth. However, if we had a second moon orbiting our planet right now, we should be able to evidently see that. I just don't think that's the case when it comes to God. Now, on the cosmological argument, let me just say in the few seconds I have left, he has given no alternative hypothesis to the God hypothesis. He started out doing that, it seemed, or at least maybe beginning the foundation of it in his opening remarks. However, now he has totally abandoned any attempt at that and simply said, I don't think that God as the cause is a warranted belief. However, he has not dealt with the evidence that I have set forth for that. All he has said is that we may have a chain of Big Bangs, or we don't know what happened before the Big Bang, or we don't know what might stand outside of the universe, or I disagree with Hawking. But I want you to see that so far we have heard no argument, no serious formal argument or any other why the cosmological argument fails. It just seems to be that he claims, I just think there's not enough evidence yet, and we wonder how much will it take.
On the moral issue, the moral argument, there's no question that from God's point of view, right, from an omniscient point of view, so species eternitatis, God sees the big picture. So he sees why he has allowed the amount of suffering and evil that exists in the world. The problem is that we don't have God's point of view. We have our point of view. And from our point of view, my point was that the evidence, and I think Hume, you have to read Hume here to see it, the evidence is, if not conclusive, which I don't believe it is certainly powerful to make us think twice about just simply granting that the God hypothesis is the best explanation for the evil that we have. My statement is not to deny the existence of God. My interest is simply to stick, as you said, to the evidence. The evidence simply doesn't warrant with the degree of probability, deductive or inductive, the inductive probability, but deductive logical certainty that we have, that the existence of God can be proven one way or the other. So I am open to the fact that, right, as we only live what? We're in the 7,000 years of history. We only live in one very small space-time slice of the universe. It's about 13 to 15 billion years old. We're only seeing a small picture. I grant you that from the small picture, it is not enough to conclude that because of suffering we experience, therefore there is no God. But by the same token, I'm saying that our perspective is so myopic and so limited that to make these grandiose claims from effect back to causes is precarious. Because simply the evidence is not enough. You're right, I haven't given you an argument, but I have shown you that people like Darwin, evolutionary biologists, Stephen Hawking, physicists, have given evidence, tangible evidence, experimental evidence, not theoretical, not conceptual, that we have a problem. And the question is, I think they do overstep the bounds of science when they claim too much, like Hawkins does, in claiming that we come from nothing. But I'm saying the evidence is tenuous, indirect enough to make us pause, right, when we make claims about what we can prove about God or against God. I advise for modesty. I advise from evidential point of view for a modest agnosticism. Let me quote the words of Immanuel Kant in the preface to the second edition. I am going to put limits to knowledge to make room for faith. My relationship to God is based on faith. I realize it is not enough, but I stand with Luther and Calvin that my faith in God depends on the God who holds me, not on the evidence for or against that I can adduce. I, as a human being, see the fragility of the evidence, but that makes it even more to trust on the grace of God who sustains me through doubt and through skepticism. I want to make that clear before all of you live here tonight. I'm quite surprised and kind of pleased that you created a bifurcation between the God of the Bible and reason. But then, it seems to me that we're on the opposite side of the divide. You are willing to use reason to judge revelation. And that means then that you're willing to judge the passage of Deuteronomy 20:16 and say, that could not have been God. But here you have a problem. If the God who gave the command is not the rational God, then we know the knowledge of God through reason, and we can simply let go of revelation. But if the God of revelation is the God, the real God, that you believe in, then that God is immoral because he commands mass genocide. I go back to the words of Kant in the critique of religion within the limits of reason alone. If you hear a God, whether in the Bible or the Quran or any other book that purports to be from God, telling you to go and kill some people, you must say that it is not God. And I cannot go with it because my reason tells me no. Now, I agree with you. Morality, local morality, or morality of a naturalistic basis does not deliver the high-power morality, the objective, universal, transcendent, mind-independent morality that you advocate. But neither does the Bible give us that. And I agree with you. Local morality is weak. But I submit on the basis of the evidence, even if there is no God, just from Kant alone, right, just from Kant and moral theory alone, we can see that we're not devoid of a moral sense. We cannot perhaps get to morality the way Plato conceived morality. We may not even get to morality and reason the way Kant conceived of it. We have a much modest morality not with capital N, lowercase m, but that will do, and that can help us work our way through the morass of suffering and violence that we live in today. We may not have the perfect morality, but we have enough to live, even if there is no God. All right, my closing remarks are very brief. I want to thank Dr. Braxton. We have had an incredibly intense debate, and I acknowledge you as my brother, and I know you do too. God bless you. Really great. You're absolutely great. Thank you, brother. And I hope that the people of God here have seen, and you all deserve, a good debate, but also understand that both he and I stand with faith in God. For different reasons, perhaps, overlapping reasons, because I do believe he has faith in God, not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of faith too. We just simply lean in slightly different ways. But I hope all of you have been edified. My conclusion again is, that's because the evidence is not enough. It doesn't mean that God has not touched our lives, and that because of Edwards, perhaps, because of Schleiermacher, I believe that what happened to me in Christ is something that I cannot deny. It happened to me when I was 7 years old, January 22nd, 1970, 8 o'clock at night. I was living in Hialeah, 9th Street, right on 1st Avenue. and that experience changed my life. And I'm comforted by the fact that Schleiermacher says the same thing. Through all the doubts of skepticism, my experience among the pietists, the Moravian brethren, have sustained me through all these years. Again, perhaps because of my anti-rationalist biases, because of the fact that I believe that the experience is primary, I kind of relish tonight arguing against any evidential or logical or probabilistic proof for God. To me, faith suffices. But there's no question, and I said it at the beginning and I said it in conclusion, I must remain open to evidence. If one day intelligent design is able to produce a theory comparable in scope, explanatory power, elegance, and empirical scientific support, then we must have to say that we can not only believe in God by faith, but that we have empirical proof of some kind, perhaps not perfect certitude, but certainly proof, perhaps overwhelming proof, that there is a God on the basis of evidence alone. That day has not come yet. Intelligent design is in its infancy. It may go nowhere, but it may bloom into a great theory, a comprehensive theory that will replace the theory of evolution. Let me remind you, when Einstein was working in the patent office in the 1900s, nobody could give him a job. He applied to different jobs. And then he came up with the theory of relativity that changed the course of physics. Many people said he had to be wrong. Well, guess what? He could be right. Let me say something else. Lemaitre, a French priest, used Einstein's equations and said those equations point to a finite universe. Mr. Einstein forgot that he was a scientist, and perhaps like Dawkins insisted that Lemaitre had to be wrong, that he had wrongly interpreted the equations of relativity. But guess what? Even when he had the opposition of Fred Hoyle, who argued for a steady-state universe, an atheist version, even when he had Bertrand Russell saying that the universe is eternal, even when he had Einstein saying the universe is eternal, Lemaitre, a Catholic priest, stood by the evidence. And now today, his theory is the dominant theory of the origins of the cosmos. Having said that, is that enough to take us back to God, the God of theism? No, it's just simply not enough yet. That it might be in the future, we all must be open, because we must be open to truth. Right now, faith is good enough for me. There were times when theism did not have the clout or the champions that it has now. It counts with William Lane Craig, as you mentioned. It counts with Gary Habermas. It counts with other great John Geisler, Norman Geisler, who I'm heard here in Miami. It counts with, you name it, all these great apologists. I have all their books and gone through them. Tremendous power. But before, there was a dearth, right? Theism was pretty low. I mean, nobody cared for it. Guess what? What happens when science changes? And again, we go back to famine. Today's feast. One day we may be famine. If we trust, if we put this belief in God on the basis of evidence, then we must be prepared to go the way of evidence. And one day the evidence may go against us. I say that we have to be very careful here. Evidence is enough. But the faith in God has sustained people for thousands of years in good times and bad times. And I recommend to you, whatever you think of this debate, faith in God stands, because we stand by faith, by the grace of God. We do not hold ourselves up. We do not ascend to God by works, but it's the grace of God that comes down to us and holds us to thick and thin. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Let me make one thing abundantly clear right here at the beginning of my final speech tonight. First of all, am I on? Okay. All right. First of all, it's important for you to understand that I did not say, as Professor Alvarez has characterized me, I did not say that the God of the Bible is not the God that I have proposed tonight. No, they are one and the same. I'm just saying tonight, the subject of this debate has not been the atrocities of the Old Testament or anything such as that. Tonight's debate has not been, is the Bible inerrant or anything such as that. Tonight's debate has been, can man demonstrate the existence of God? We have not spoken specifically of the gods of Hinduism or the God of Christianity or the God of Islam or anything such as that. But I want to say that I believe that the God we have discussed tonight is completely uniform with and perfectly just as much the God of Christian Scripture as He can be. It's just that that's not the subject of tonight's debate. That's so important that you get that. Now, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, he keeps mentioning this skepticism that he has regarding the initial cause of the universe. He says, you're right, I haven't given any argument for what else could have caused the existence of the universe. You're right, I haven't proposed why atheism might be true on this basis. All I have argued is that we don't have enough good reason yet to believe that that God is the cause of the universe. However, this kind of unbridled skepticism would prevent us from ever functioning in the world. You begin to wonder how the kind of advancements in science that he's mentioned a while ago could have ever come about if someone maintained skepticism such as that. How could we have ever had a Copernican revolution if there was that kind of skepticism that just kept going on unbridled? It seems that at some point we have to say that the evidence is overwhelming. I've given the evidence from the teleological argument, and it seems that in his last couple of speeches he has abandoned any attempt to try and thwart off that argument. When it comes to the problem of evil, he has said that he thinks that there's good reason to believe that on the basis of evil, we cannot accept that there is a high probability for God's existence. But I've shown why Wykstra's Cornea argument, I think, solves that problem. And we've heard no response to that unless I've missed something. So I greatly appreciate his gesture to come and rejoice with me that we are both brothers. And yes, I thank God for that. When he gave his life to Christ, I want you to know I rejoice with you in that, my brother. And that is wonderful. And I too have given my life over to Christianity. And I do stand in faith. And in times in my life when I have found myself in severe doubt, God was there by my side. And praise God for that. Nevertheless, tonight this was a debate regarding the evidence. And I have given you 3 lines of evidence that I claimed at the beginning I believe warrant the belief in God on the basis of those evidences. And we have heard time and again, I just haven't seen enough evidence. I just haven't seen enough evidence. When P.C.W. Davies says that the chances are incredibly astronomical, and I give quotes for that, he says, I still haven't seen enough evidence. And I just want to say, when will the evidence be enough? It seems that he has restricted it to a very small set of criteria. He says maybe one day intelligent design will develop to the point that it will be able to provide us with convincing evidence that there is a God, but we're not there yet. Now listen very closely, friends. It seems that what he has said in this is that if naturalism, if we ever discover a natural God in the natural universe, or some sort of natural God, or some sort of convincing natural example of a cause, that would be good enough, or an explanation from naturalism. But friends, that is to exclude God as a possibility, the kind of God the Bible describes from the beginning, because by definition, the initial cause of the existence of the universe must have stood outside of time. I thank him for his graciousness, and I know that this is the final speech of this, and I'm sure that he could give a wonderful response, and we could go on for hours, and I appreciate you so much, and I hope that you've been enriched by tonight's debate. Thank you so much.